The winter of 1979 came cold and cruel to Afghanistan. Snow buried the mountain passes, and the valleys were haunted by silence broken only by distant gunfire. Families fled their villages in the dead of night, carrying little more than bread, prayer beads, and the weight of uncertainty. The Soviet Union had rolled its tanks across the border. Helicopters circled the skies, and in the chaos, millions of Afghans became wanderers, some trudging across the mountains into Pakistan, others hiding in caves and ruins, clinging to life. It was in these shadows, before the world knew the word mujahideen, before the CIA began flooding the region with weapons, that something quieter began. Not rifles, not rockets, but sacks of flour, blankets, medical kits, bandages stained red with hope. This was the hidden beginning of Operation Cyclone. When the Red Army stormed Afghanistan, they expected quick dominance. Instead, they met resistance, scattered, disorganized, but burning with faith. Villages were bombed, roads were cut off, crops were destroyed, and so began the exodus. By 1980, millions of Afghans poured across the Khyber Pass into Pakistan. Entire families arrived barefoot, frost clinging to their clothes. Children with hollow cheeks clutched tin cups, waiting for water. Women sat in tents of torn canvas, reciting prayers over the sick. The refugee camps swelled until they looked like sprawling cities of despair. Rows upon rows of tents stretched into the horizon, buzzing with flies, heavy with the smell of hunger. The world saw glimpses of this misery. Aid groups came, journalists reported. But what few knew was that Washington was already there, quietly, cautiously, watching, calculating. In the halls of Washington, Afghanistan was not just a tragedy. It was an opportunity, a chance to bleed the Soviet Union in its own Vietnam. But the year was 1980, and the White House understood a dangerous truth. If America rushed to arm rebels immediately, Moscow would see it as a direct declaration of war. The Cold War could ignite into fire. So before the weapons came, before billions of dollars were poured into rifles and rockets, something else happened: humanitarian aid. The CIA, working in shadows, funneled money into relief disguised as charity. Washington coordinated with Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, but kept its fingerprints hidden. Pallets of food and crates of medicine crossed the border under the cover of night. Officially, America could deny involvement. Unofficially, the Lifeline had begun. In dusty refugee camps outside Peshawar, whispers spread: American food has arrived. It came in plain sacks, often without labels. Sometimes marked with the emblem of a relief organization, sometimes with no sign at all. Flour, lentils, powdered milk. Injections for disease. Bandages for the wounded. Doctors, many Afghans themselves, worked tirelessly under the buzzing of kerosene lamps, stitching wounds from shrapnel, treating infections, saving lives that the world would never hear about. To the refugees, it mattered little where the supplies came from. What mattered was that the children ate, that the fevers cooled, that hope flickered, however faintly. In one camp, an old Afghan man was seen clutching a loaf of bread as though it were gold. His words echoed softly. Bullets destroy life, but bread saves it. That was the irony. Operation Cyclone, later remembered as the largest covert weapons program in history, began with bread. Washington kept its involvement quiet. President Carter's administration feared being seen as dragging America into another foreign quagmire so soon after Vietnam. So, the humanitarian side of Cyclone was deliberately buried. No photographs of American officials handing out food. No speeches about compassion. Instead, relief workers moved in silence. Money was routed through third parties, international NGOs, religious charities, and sometimes directly through Pakistan's government. The CIA watched, measured, and reported back. But as the supplies flowed, something else began to grow: trust. Afghan refugees saw that someone, somewhere, had not abandoned them. Among the whispers of betrayal and despair, there were murmurs of gratitude. And for Washington, this was not just kindness, it was strategy. Humanitarian aid softened the ground, built connections, and laid the foundation for what would soon follow: weapons. To understand this forgotten chapter, one must walk the dirt roads of the refugee camps. Picture a child named Sammy, no older than 7. His father killed in a bombing raid, his mother gaunt from hunger. He sits in line for hours, waiting for a tin bowl of lentil soup. Soup made possible by American dollars, though he would never know. Or Aisha, a young nurse, who once studied in Kabul. Now, she moves tent to tent, treating wounds with scarce supplies. She holds in her hands a box of American-made syringes, smuggled in silence. With each injection, she saves a life. These stories never reach the headlines. The world would only remember the later images of armed mujahideen firing Stinger missiles. But in the early 1980s, the quiet war was fought not with rockets, but with medicine. By 1982, the refugee crisis had swollen to one of the largest in modern history. Over 3 million Afghans lived in camps across Pakistan, and Washington began to change its approach. Humanitarian aid had been a beginning, but the tide of war demanded escalation. The CIA's program shifted gears, from food to firearms, from bandages to bombs. Yet, those first years had planted seeds. Many Afghan commanders, who would later receive weapons, first encountered American assistance in the form of medicine for their fighters or food for their starving families. To them, America was not just a distant power. It was a lifeline. Today, when historians speak of Operation Cyclone, they talk of billions of dollars in weapons, of Stinger missiles that brought down Soviet helicopters, of the rise of militant groups that would one day haunt the world. But few remember the beginning. Few remember the bread. The humanitarian side of Cyclone was overshadowed, buried in secrecy, lost in the noise of the Cold War. It was never meant to be celebrated. It was meant to be forgotten. And yet, in the memory of the refugees who survived those bitter winters, it mattered. To the mother who fed her child for one more day, to the wounded fighter stitched back to health, to the old man clutching his bread like treasure, it was everything. History often remembers wars for their battles, their weapons, their victories. But hidden in the shadows are the quiet moments that shaped the lives of millions. Operation Cyclone would eventually become one of the most controversial covert operations of the 20th century, arming fighters who would later fracture into militias, some turning their weapons against the very West that had armed them. But before the weapons, before the chaos, there was compassion. Calculated, yes, but compassion nonetheless. And perhaps the truest image of that forgotten beginning is not a fighter with a rocket launcher, but a refugee child, sitting in the dust, breaking bread that arrived in silence, carried by invisible hands across mountains of war.